Welcome back to ＳիվիլNet. I'm your host, Patrick Elliott, and I'm actually delighted to be joined by my friend and the director of the Regional Studies Center, an independent think tank based in Yerevan, Mr. Richard Giragossian. Richard, thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Patrick.
We got so much to cover that probably this podcast can run for 3 hours, so we'll try to condense it as much as physically possible. We're now, at the time of recording this, obviously post the fall of Artsakh. What do you think the future would hold for Artsakhis and the refugees? What can be done realistically at the international level to ensure their rights?
I think the only realistic assessment going forward in this difficult post-war reality is Armenia building self-sufficiency, and the future of the Armenians of Artsakh depend less on Armenia and more on the coming implosion of Azerbaijan proper. In other words, the outlook for instability in Azerbaijan is the only positive scenario for a regaining of Nagorno-Karabakh.
Let's expand on that. What do you mean by the implosion? Because from what I look at, it does seem like it's the likeliest next Syria. It's run by a single family. The only industry is oil. They have various ethnic minorities who have been kind of quietly pushed down, but are not, the Dalish, the Lezgins, the supposed Caucasian Albanians, which is like 10,000 left. So it doesn't look like there's much holding that country together. What's your impression?
Well, the reason I'm so pessimistic about the future for stability in Azerbaijan is based on the points you've already raised. We have a Shakespearean family dynasty, power passed from father to son, Lady Macbeth as Mrs. Aliyev on the scene. But the real, let's say, weakness and vulnerability of Azerbaijan is the simple lack of legitimacy. A lack of legitimacy coupled with the cancer of corruption within the Azerbaijani system and exacerbated by the lack of diversification economically. However, I think the real trigger for unrest in Azerbaijan is a combination of two other factors. One is President Aliyev of Azerbaijan is riding a tiger of nationalism, militant, maximalist policy. He's not well suited to play that role. And moreover, we also see a second factor where he's caught in between rival interests between Turkey and Russia. The current tactical alliance between Russia and Turkey is the aberration. It's the exception to the historical norm. And I do expect a brewing confrontation between rival Russian-backed and Turkish-backed factions. And we already see early signs of this. For example, the Azerbaijani Minister of Defense, very ambitious. He's backed by the Turkish military in particular.
This is Zakir Hasanov, right?
Yes.
Okay.
He has done much to undermine his rival within the Baku power system, his rival, the foreign minister. And this is also evident in terms of diplomatic engagement. Whenever there was a degree of progress in talks between Armenia and Azerbaijan in Brussels or Washington, events on the ground usually sabotaged or undermined that progress. This was very much a power struggle within Baku. It's also one that Aliyev is not well placed or strong enough to maintain control. That is, in effect, bad enough. What makes it even worse for the Azerbaijani people is there's no steam valve for dissent. It's a very tightly controlled regime.
It's getting worse as well.
It's the North Korea of the Caucasus.
Yes.
And as you say, getting worse, it's actually evident now that even the opposition and independent media who were supporting the government against Artsakh are now being targeted, are now being arrested. They are turning against themselves. And I think this is where Armenia's outlook for stability is in sharp contrast to the question of not if, but when Azerbaijan implodes.
Interesting. I want to touch up on something because you're talking about the defense minister. I've looked into this extensively. Obviously, I have some linguistic limitations. I'm sure a lot of literature's out there in Turkish or Russian, but there's very little about the extent of Azerbaijan's military reforms. What we do know effectively is what the Turks did is they took essentially 3 battalions of special forces, so 7,000 to 8,000 men. They trained them up. They got them up to speed, and then they were rotating them as they were advancing through Artsakh, right? This is in the 2020 war. But there's nothing, I always refer to this. There's an interesting post on Reddit, on Armenian Reddit. This was after the war, probably 2021, early 2021, if I'm not mistaken. But somebody wrote a thing about his experience on Armenian bases, right, serving the Armenian armed forces. And he was talking about, the corruption of the lower level officers, the cigarettes, the gambling, mostly not doing much, And then what was interesting was you had a bunch of Azeris commenting going, hey, I served in 2018, I served in 20, and it was like that for us too. Yeah, it was like that for us too. It was just really interesting that you had this kind of cross-border cohesion after these people had just kind of been killing each other. But that was interesting to me because I was like, it looks like how can you have systemic reforms, especially militarily, right, where it requires flexible thinking and accountability in a country that has no accountability, doesn't allow for any flexible thinking. So can you reconcile that for us, like from what you know? How extensive are their actual reforms? Or is it, again, just the tip of the spear, and once we can obliterate that, we do stand a chance?
That's a very good question. And in fact, before we actually turn to talking about Armenia's defense reform, in assessing the Azerbaijani armed forces, its military capability, and the outlook for reforms, it's necessary first to go back to 2020. The war of 2020 was unprecedented for both the intensity and the scale. It's also a reflection that we, the Armenian side, were far too arrogant and complacent, and we underestimated the steady buildup by the Azerbaijani military. For years, however, this Armenian position was justified. The Azerbaijani armed forces for decades was a source of corruption, and it was kept weak on purpose in order to prevent any threat to the Aliyev family. What changed, however, was a turning point in 2016 during that first offensive by Azerbaijan.
The April War?
The April War, and then through the period of 2020, Azerbaijan was dangerously gaining military capability. For example, the first time we saw the use of so-called combined arms, the coordination of infantry, armored, even helicopters in terms of a military assault. In 2020, what's interesting as well is the Azerbaijanis were dangerously stretched to their limit. They stopped, and after 44 days, their supply lines, the logistical weaknesses, were catching up with them. But militarily, the war of 2020 was dangerously incomplete. They did not win enough. Therefore, what we saw this past September, the devastating ethnic cleansing of Artsakh. But my point here is the Azerbaijani armed forces of 2020 is very different than the current outlook. The Azerbaijani military today is much weaker, much less combat ready. There is much less of a Turkish military presence or assistance than before.
Really?
And what we also see, the Turkish defense minister is both powerful and popular with the Azerbaijani special forces, not the mainstream army. This is very important in terms of the army still being under the control of the more Russian-oriented general staff, and the Air Force of Azerbaijan remains weak and underfunded. So the potential for renewed offensive capability is much less than it was in 2020. And the outlook is even worse because Azerbaijan, both diplomatically and militarily, is much more isolated than ever before. There's also growing rivalry where the Turkish military has less of a role and is very frustrated at the Israeli participation in supporting Azerbaijan. So we don't see any real defense reform underway in Azerbaijan. This is
just
more
buying equipment, essentially.
Well, even the procurement has slowed down. And what we see is it's more about building the political power of the defense minister through military means rather than reform throughout all branches of the Azerbaijani armed forces.
Mm-hmm. So, Richard, one thing I want to comment on, though, I mean, for example, they announced like just a couple of days ago that that Azerbaijan successfully conducted the use of smart bombs with their air force. So their planes, their Soviet-era planes, have been kind of upgraded by Turkish engineering recently, and they successfully did some exercises and deployed smart bombs. You have, of course, their literal once a month exercises with the Turkish Air Force and the Turkish Special Forces. I mean, that stuff, for lack of a better term, that stuff is intimidating to us. So how can they reach those capabilities if the Air Force is underfunded, as you say?
Actually, I disagree. In other words, the exercise involving one and only one confirmed smart bomb was more...
It's not confirmed, by the way. It's Azeri sources. So these were not observed. I do want to qualify that. It's important, but yeah.
True, good point. Yeah. What we see, however, that posture, that military exercise was not directed against Armenia. It was directed against Iran. And it's more driven by the relationship between the return of Netanyahu in Israel and President Aliyev of Azerbaijan. In other words, in some ways, militarily, the relationship is between Azerbaijan and the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, which is quite different. What we also see is the Air Force exercise also follows last year's maritime security exercise in southern Azerbaijan along the border with Iran. This was a move by Azerbaijan for Israel to pressure Iran. And in this context, it's much less of an air threat against Armenia. And the other point here is for military tactics, Azerbaijan would better use helicopters. In other words, rotary wing aircraft against southern Armenia, not fixed wing. So I don't see it as that much of a concern, and we've never really had an air attack against Armenia proper. Moreover, we've made tremendous progress in Armenia in terms of air defense.
Yeah. Well, the French procurement is an interesting one. But before we move to France, because I do want to cover that. So the one pressing concern, I would say concern, the thing in the back of my mind, right? Look, if the Turks wanted to invade us, it's a highway in the Ararat Valley into Yerevan. I don't see that as a potential likely scenario. I don't think it's politically expedient for them. This is something all diasporans are constantly bringing up to me. Aren't you afraid that Turkey and Azerbaijan will attack together? That being said, for me, the main thing is that the Azeris have found in Turkey a source of bottomless military support. Right? Yeah, Israel is consistent, but the Turks they have their new fully autonomous fighter plane that's going to be released soon. They have the Akinci drones that are even better than the TB2. They just announced that they've successfully tested. And again, these are Turkish sources, so who knows what the quality of it is as an unnamed American Defense Department friend of mine told me you can make anything look good on some training video, right? But let's assume for let's cover our arrogance of the last few years and assume that this is a genuine threat. Like they've released footage of a new an anti-tank missile, some equivalent to the Javelin that has a 14-kilometer range. So we need to assume that we're going to be facing these things. How can Armenia potentially offset this bottomless source of advanced weaponry from Turkey?
Well, first of all, I'm glad we found an issue where we disagree. Yeah. In specifics, what I mean is the Turkish military threat to Armenia is actually less. The Turkish military assistance to Azerbaijan is also significantly less. What the Turkish government is expressing to NATO, to the Americans, and at times to the Armenian government is that Turkey is very worried about being dragged into a conflict by Azerbaijan against Russian interests on the ground in this region. and it's something they're resisting. It's also related to the fact that the Turkish government is very frustrated and angry that the little brother of the relationship, Azerbaijan, has such control over their policy options in this region. But if we look at the military threat, I do think Turkey is much more focused on Syria. And what's most interesting is there is a new trend and a new development. Azerbaijan and Turkey are moving very rapidly far apart over the issue of Hamas. Turkey remains, under President Erdogan, much more vocal in supporting the Palestinians and Hamas in particular, whereas Azerbaijan is concretely demonstrating its commitment to the Israelis. This is a growing fissure. It's a growing division, meaning that the outlook for Turkish support for Azerbaijan is more questionable. The second part here is, let's look at the 2020 war. Turkey came away from that war after giving unprecedented military support to Azerbaijan. It came away with much less than expected and less than promised. It had expected a peacekeeping role around Nagorno-Karabakh. That was denied. It was simply limited to a symbolic presence.
Did the Russians deny it or the Azeris themselves?
Both.
Wow.
Well, the part of the reason here is there was even Azerbaijani military frustration that it was Turkish Air Force officers operating the drones in the war of 2020.
Yeah.
The frustration for the Azerbaijanis was that the Turks were taking away their victory. And there is a resentment there. But the second point here is, after the war of 2020, Russia excluded Turkey from any projects on the restoration of trade and transport. The working group between Armenia, Russia, and Azerbaijan, for example. So for Turkey, it feels like it was taken advantage of. And I do think we need to better exploit the growing division and disparity of interests between Turkey and Azerbaijan.
Yeah, it's something we've never been able to do. Though I will say, like, for me, what's interesting is that you do see that there are some unprecedented foreign policy victories that we have, right? Like we've successfully flipped a country that has been for the last century and a half vehemently anti-Armenia, which is Germany, and now it looks like we're in the process of flipping a second one. We just signed yesterday some defense cooperation agreement with the UK, of all countries. So there does seem to be this willingness to try to be flexible and to engage. I mean, Saudi Arabia, we signed diplomatic relations. In his televised address the other day, Prime Minister Pashinyan said that he's open to even establishing relations with Pakistan, which is interesting to me. I think that there seems to be the awakening of flexible thinking. It's still not enough in my opinion, but it's still a start. So I do understand the continued engagement with Turkey. It's as a descendant of a genocide survivor, I'm not a fan of it, but I understand the need to do it. As somebody who lives here and understands the reality, it makes sense that we should exploit that. I do want to talk a little bit more about the fear that, I mean, there's no war heroes from 2020 on the Azeri side. We don't know their names. We don't know. There's no songs, as far as I know, from what I saw. And it does seem like Aliyev ensured that the victory was to him and him alone, right? For him showing up in Shushi and showing up in now recently in Lachin and Kelbajar and showing up on purpose to be the face of it. Do you think there's a growing fear at home that he might be deposed, or that the army has gotten a little bit too powerful at this point, or it's not really a concern because he's still riding that coattails of victory?
I would say there's a genuine fear, but much less a genuine threat. In other words, there is a degree of paranoia in any kind of dictatorship like Azerbaijan. But I do think President Aliyev, especially in the military parade in an empty Stepanakert, demonstrated one factor or achievement. This is the first time in his life that President Ilham Aliyev has stepped out of the shadow of his father. Yeah. Psychologically, it's very important. It also raises expectations, and I do think for this reason, driven by domestic political considerations, Azerbaijan wants conflict. will continue to demonize Armenia for domestic internal power. And I do think that's the real threat. What we also see at the same time, as you pointed to, Armenia is regaining the diplomatic initiative. What it's also about, for example, is exploring security options and ties not just with the West, but also with India and China, for that matter. That's very important because our only procurement deal as of today has been with India. Yeah. And it's also important because Russia does not see that as a direct challenge or threat. We've learned from the Georgians. We're not seeking NATO membership. For Armenia, that's not the answer to our problems. And I do think Armenia is much more prudent in gaining as many friends and security partners as possible. And it is a small state strategy here, whereas Azerbaijan increasingly is isolated, is actually much more a threat to regional security than ever before. And finally, I think the important precedent from the war of 2020 and from the September surrender of Artsakh was it undermines Western values. It undermines the West's geopolitical position because it seems to have validated the use of force over diplomacy and vindicated authoritarian power over democracy. This also makes Armenia much more strategically significant.
Well, even in terms of this this corridor in Syunik, right, is that it's so... So one thing that I noticed a lot of Armenians miss out on, a lot of local analysts and so on, so they keep talking it from the Russian perspective, but they're forgetting that Baku is a major port on China's Belt and Road Initiative and its middle corridor. So this whole project, it's an issue for the United States interest, not just for Russia circumventing sanctions, but also for China getting a foothold in the region. So before we move on to the reforms, one last thing about Turkey, because it also plays into this. Isn't there this genuine concern that Turkey is instigating this push for this corridor? And if they see that Azerbaijan would have the chance, it would bring back a very robust level of support?
Well, first of all, I see it a little bit differently. I always hesitate to use the term corridor. That's very much limited to Azerbaijan's perspective or interpretation. The whole reason Azerbaijan insists on corridor is also in their mind they wanted something comparable to the Lachin corridor.
Yeah. They wanted
extraterritoriality. Yeah. However, that no longer applies. What Turkey seeks is a road and rail connection, and it's to Central Asia. It's not just to Azerbaijan.
Yeah, of course.
At the same time, what we see is the U.S. government in recent congressional testimony has made it clear that any forced construction or attempt by Azerbaijan to force the creation of such a corridor is a red line, will be met with resistance. So I do think what we see going on now, the resumption of border demarcation negotiations between Armenia and Azerbaijan, also hold the promise that we can return to talks about the operational details of the road and rail links, because it does mean two important things for Armenia. One is Armenia can become a transit state, overcoming its isolation. And second, I do think economic interdependence is the most effective way for Armenia to regain deterrence, to change the calculus of the threat of renewed hostilities.
Well, isn't it McDonald's peace theory that two countries that have a McDonald's don't go to war with each other? But the 2008 Georgia-Russia war kind of broke that theory. But I agree. I think the unfortunate truth is that they're not going to pack up and go to Central Asia anytime soon. So eventually, whether it takes 100 years or 1,000 years, we're going to have to trade with our neighbors. And if the French and the British, who were doing unspeakable things to each other 1,000 years ago and literally fought a war for over 1,000 years, can today be both offering to help us here as a united front. I think maybe someday, I hope, we'll stop killing each other.
But in that regard, there's one interesting lesson that we've only recently learned, and that is Russia, Turkey, and even Azerbaijan respect strength, not weakness, not concession.
No, I agree with that entirely. So that's actually a perfect segue. Let's start with the negative of our own internal reforms. I mean, we're from what we can see, and these are external assessments because there's so little of it that's going around, is that there are in fact reforms underway. There are some interesting and some good stuff, but on the negative side of things, it's few and far between, or it's not deep enough. What can you tell us about the ongoing reforms in the Armenian armed forces?
Well, in a strategic sense, I support the concept of defense reform. And what I mean is there's been a modification. What defense reform represents now is a transformation away from conscription to professional service contract-based officers and personnel, which means a tremendous downsizing of the Armenian army. And I do think the emphasis is more on quality over quantity, but the end state objective is to create a home guard, territorial defense, with little in terms of offensive threat capability. I think for this part of our history, it is realistic and prudent. But I do think much more needs to be done on the lower levels of the Armenian armed forces. It's a little bit limited to the lowest level of support for reform and the senior level, but it's the mid-level officers. And this is where the key building block for Armenia is military education. It's training and doctrine. We need to escape the trap of the Soviet legacy, which, by the way, Azerbaijan continues to copy the Russian model. And we need to prepare to fight the next war, not to refight the last war.
Yeah. That's interesting. I find like there's a lot of potential. For example, we do have countries that we can copy, but we're met with certain excuses that in wartime it's difficult to do some reforms. So for example, we asked the Estonians, and the Estonians said, "Well, we fired all of our officers and we just built a new officer corps." Can Armenia do that realistically?
I say no, only because we have an urgent critical threat to Armenia's territorial integrity and security. We have Azerbaijani military personnel, as of today, still on Armenian territory. So I do think we don't have the luxury of time, nor do we have the luxury of enough space to develop generational reform. Yeah. However, I do see the advantage in terms of a more stable, much more democratic government, where we're able to holistically apply anti-corruption, democratic reform with defense and security sector reform. The pressing challenge for us now is much more coming from Moscow than Baku. In terms of, yes, Azerbaijan poses an immediate threat, but Russia also is a burden to Armenia. The cumulative damage of our overdependence on Russia, but Russia is now a serious security challenge for Armenia as an unreliable so-called partner. What we also see, however, is the bigger picture. No matter what happens in Ukraine, we will see an angry, vengeful Putin, Russia striking back, lashing out at all of its neighbors. And it's Azerbaijan that has much more embarrassingly humiliated the Russian peacekeepers and Russia on the ground. In other words, Russia has a long memory and very little forgiveness. I do think that Azerbaijan is much higher on the list of targets post-Ukraine. However, for Armenia, as we've seen in the last 2 days, Russia has imposed trade restrictions, cutting off Armenian exports and imports, and there is a degree of economic warfare against Armenia from, of all places, Russia.
Yeah, I think it's just the beginning, even though, of course, since we're part of this Eurasian Economic Union, that's illegal what they're doing, but of course it hasn't stopped the Russians before. But that's interesting that you mentioned they're angrier, they'd be more vengeful towards Baku than Yerevan, because the impression is that they've been operating in tandem. That there's a quid pro quo, and Putin doesn't mind a couple dead peacekeepers here, a couple dead peacekeepers there.
Let me push back on that, because in what seems to be Russian complicity in the war of 2020, cooperation, complicity, giving Azerbaijan the green light. I think it's more about Russia's weakness, not strength, where Russia has been distracted and overwhelmed by its failed invasion of Ukraine and has been unable to fulfill even the terms of its own ceasefire agreement that it imposed after the war of 2020. The paradox here is relations on the highest level, Putin-Aliyev, remain strong.
Yeah.
In fact, Aliyev does a good job in playing Putin, much better than Pashinyan. Aliyev is also a product of Moscow as much as he was of Turkey.
Well, he speaks Azeri with a Russian accent, apparently. Yeah.
And the paradox is that the other side of this, on the ground, the Russian peacekeepers were consistently humiliated, embarrassed, and Azerbaijan did a good job at defying the Kremlin. But they got away with it because of Turkish support and because of Russian distraction. But my point is there's a storm on the horizon. No matter what happens in Ukraine, we should expect Russia to lash out and seek retribution against Azerbaijan. The only thing delaying that revenge is the gas deal, where Azerbaijan has duped the Europeans and has engaged in a virtual swap agreement, re-exporting Russian gas to the European Union.
I don't think they duped them. I think the Europeans are aware. I just think they have, they have to convince their populace that they're not freezing in the winter, and frankly, they're happy to close their eyes to it. But then again, I don't have a very high opinion of any bureaucrat, so. Let's talk about the Armenian army reforms. I think it was very interesting. We just kind of moved away, so I want to make sure our viewers get the picture. I mean, in terms of recent developments, there have been some really striking developments. Notably, of course, the deal we struck with France. But just yesterday we signed a security cooperation agreement with the UK, which is a first. Of course, there's the weaponry from India, and as military expert Leonid Nersisyan pointed out just a couple of days ago, what we've received from India has essentially, from what we know, kind of restocked a lot of what we lost from the 2020 war. India alone. That's not counting the air defenses we're getting from France. We signed an agreement with Thales, the French Raytheon, essentially. But there is a lot more in the pipeline, apparently, that's being negotiated. So there's that. Something a lot of people don't know about is we've been cooperating with Georgia, who has been helping us with our NCO Corps because they have experience. So it's quite interesting what's going on. What can you say about the ongoing reforms?
Well, first of all, I do think the strategic difference is in terms of military reform. The key difference here is Armenia has become much more significant and much more popular. In other words, whether it's the French, the British, the European Union, or the Americans, the West is coming to Armenia. Armenia is not going to them begging for help and support. That's a key difference. What that means for Armenian defense reform is we have to be very careful not to miss the opportunity to deepen security ties with as many as partners as possible. It's not seeking to challenge Russia, it's seeking to overcome Russia in terms of what's called diversification. This is why China is as important as France, if not in some ways more important.
Sorry to cut you off, but didn't they refuse to, as I mentioned, Baku is a major port for them. Didn't they refuse to help us when we asked during 2020, as far as I know?
Well, we didn't ask for direct military support. However, China has provided missiles to Armenia, both before and after 2020. We also see Armenia is the only country in the world with a specific military agreement signed with China, where working with the People's Liberation Army of China, Chinese military instructors, according to the agreement, are to come to Armenia rather than just Armenian officers studying in Chinese institutions. The reason that's important is deepening security with China increases respect for Armenia in Moscow and increases Western interest to counter that development. In other words, we need to be better at playing off one another.
Yeah.
But at the same time, defense reform is already underway. It's already a smart move away from conscription. And it's about the quality over quantity, where we need to learn from our geography, lessons from Israel, for example, a similar geography, and much less copying a Russian model that doesn't apply to Armenia.
You know, we don't have a mountain division in the Armenian army.
What does that say?
I mean, it's spectacular negligence. But I suppose my concern is that a lot of these guys are still there. These guys are still there. These guys are still they're still eating my taxpayer dollars or my taxpayer dram. They've had no shame in the fact that they sent thousands of young men to die. They still walk around with their uniforms. They're horribly overweight. They have all kinds of medals that maybe they've earned at some point but should not be wearing proudly anymore based on what happened. I'm sorry, I'm speaking as a parent here. It's extremely painful to me to have this lack of accountability. I come from I come from North America where, the state works for me, not vice versa. I don't need to respect you because you have a uniform, you're walking around. You're dishonoring the uniform at this point. So that's kind of my main thing is these guys who've all been educated in Moscow. How much do we know that they're throwing a wrench in the mechanism to ensure that we don't reform effectively or move forward? Do we know anything about that?
Well, that's a good question. This is partly why the Prime Minister of Armenia has appointed, in a political move, a defense minister with little real military experience.
You need an outsider to just kind of shake things up until...
And to drive reform downward through the ranks. But you raise an interesting point. The real key to both anti-corruption and reform within the closed armed forces of any country is something Armenia is pursuing. And I think it's smart. It's tackling corruption and incompetence indirectly in order to mitigate the potential sabotage. It's using, believe it or not, HR, human resources, where you need to address the system of promotion and assignment geographically of these commanders. This is the way to begin to pension them out. And in fact, if we look at the significant increase in the defense budget for Armenia recently, it's more about financing the buyout to get rid of the bad apples and to finance reform than it is about buying weapons. The Indian procurement, Leonid raised an interesting point, is also not just replenishing what we lost, but giving us cutting-edge technology. Because much of the Russian-provided weapons were also proved to be as ineffective as they were in the Ukrainian battle space.
Yeah, we had a lot of such cases during the 2020 war where we received the wrong ordnance or it was wet when it arrived. That's the interesting thing is that when you talk to anyone who fought in that war, they're under no illusions. They don't have any soft words for our friendly neighbor to the north, the big one. So regardless, I remain hopeful for this country. I would like to see if we can part on a positive note. What's your general impression for Armenia's future trajectory? Do you see any serious violence? I'm not asking you to predict, but do you see any indication of serious violence in the future? Do you see us kind of getting our act together and stepping up towards a brighter future?
Well, the reason I'm positive is not just personal, like you moving here from North America, but also professionally. I'm justifiably optimistic because Armenia has overcome the existential threats. In other words, we've survived the worst and we are still standing. The war of 2016, 2020, the defeat or surrender of Artsakh, we've survived each of these threats. And we have a degree of stability. We also have a surprising degree of unity where we are committed to building our country in the form of patriotism. It's not just like Azerbaijan, which is based on hating the other. And in this context, Armenia is nothing if not a nation of survivors.
I like it. Richard, thanks so much. Richard Giragossian. Thanks again for watching. I've been Pat, and we'll speak with you guys very soon.